My husband convinced himself that standing by his own wife was for fools, and he insisted we. Could you ever imagine the man you married, the one who vowed to cherish you, sending you a bill for your own wedding? Because that's exactly what Mark did to me. The air in our usually cozy dining room felt suddenly thick, choked with an unspoken tension the night he laid that spreadsheet on the table. It was a Tuesday, the fluorescent kitchen light glinting off the rows and columns, turning something innocent into a weapon. My fork was still halfway to my mouth, casserole growing cold on my plate, but my stomach had already plummeted. He had his elbows planted on the edge, fingers laced tight, jaw set in that way that meant this conversation had been rehearsed 100 times in his head. Nothing I said was going to change his script. For a terrifying second, I thought he was about to tell me he'd lost his job or maxed out a secret credit card. Instead, he cleared his throat like we were in some corporate boardroom and started talking about partnership and fairness and how things needed to change. You know, those buzzwords that never, ever mean anything good when you're just trying to enjoy dinner. My eyes scanned the sheet: housing, utilities, groceries, insurance, all neatly split into two columns: Mark and Chloe. His voice became background noise, a dull hum until one line jumped out, a dull hum until one line jumped out, a line I must have skipped the first time. And under that, in bold, almost mocking script, wedding costs, with a number next to it so staggering, so utterly insane. I honestly thought it was a joke. I looked up and Mark smiled. Not a warm, loving smile, but this stiff, almost proud smirk. He said he'd done the math, figured out a fair retroactive split now that we were moving into a more equal phase. And that, right there, was the exact moment something in my chest went completely numb. My own husband was asking me to pay him back for our wedding. Honestly, that surprised me more than anything. My first instinct was to grab that ridiculous spreadsheet and flip it right into his smug face, to ask him if he'd completely lost his mind, but I just sat there staring at the paper while he droned on about modern relationships, about how the guys at work made him realize he'd been carrying everything on his back like some old fashioned provider. How dumb that sounded when everyone else in his friend group was splitting things down the middle. He sprinkled the word partnership into every other sentence until it sounded like corporate jargon, stripped of any real meaning. And every time he said it, I could practically hear Gary's voice in the room with us. Gary, that coworker of his, the one he'd been quoting nonstop lately, the guy who loved to rant about men being taken advantage of. I pushed my plate away. Suddenly, I couldn't swallow. I asked him, my voice tight, why he thought I should pay back money his parents had insisted on spending, money for a party I'd barely had a say in. He kept his voice annoyingly calm, like he was de escalating a situation with a difficult customer. Said it wasn't about punishment, it was about balancing the scales. If we were starting fresh as equals, then it only made sense to account for the past. 7 years earlier, he'd held my hands, looked me in the eyes, and told me a real man provides. He promised I'd never have to worry about money. And now he was basically invoicing me for it. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay there in the dark next to him, listening to him snore peacefully, as if he'd just done something perfectly reasonable and could rest easy. My brain, meanwhile, was replaying every single conversation we'd ever had about money, about work, about what marriage was supposed to look like. When we got engaged, I was the one with the bigger paycheck, the cooler job. And he was the one who hated it, who told me he wanted me home. He said it made him feel like a failure that I was always traveling, always on red eye flights. I quit my job because I loved him and because he made it sound so romantic, like he was rescuing me from burnout from hotel rooms and conference calls. Now, staring at the ceiling, the chilling realization hit me he had rewritten that entire story in his head, casting himself as the victim and me as the freeloading wife. At some point before sunrise, I gave up on pretending to sleep and went to the kitchen to make coffee, just for me. When Mark wandered in later, rubbing his eyes and asking where his mug was, my own voice came out, way calmer than I felt. If we're partners now, I said, you can make your own coffee. He blinked at me like I'd just spoken a different language, then let out this short, irritated laugh, the kind you used when the internet went down like I was the glitch in his system. He said I was, twisting his words that this had nothing to do with chores or breakfast, that it was about finances and respect. Then he dropped his favorite new line again about how the guys at work had been talking about this, about how a lot of men were waking up to the fact that they were basically glorified wallets while their wives played house. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, feeling like someone had swapped out my husband for a worse, resentful version of himself while I wasn't looking. I told him, if you want an equal partner, Mark, you're getting one. And that means you can also handle your own shirts, your own lunch, and your own appointments. Because I've been doing unpaid labor for years without ever putting that on a spreadsheet. He rolled his eyes, told me I was being dramatic, that he was just trying to have an adult conversation, and then left his empty mug in the sink like a passive aggressive punctuation mark. After he left for work, I sat at that stupid kitchen table with the spreadsheet still there and opened my laptop. I logged into an old email account I hadn't used since before we got married. It felt like opening a time capsule from my old life. Newsletters from marketing conferences, messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. And in the middle of all that digital dust, one subject line made my heart jump into my throat. It was from David, my old mentor, the one who always told me it was a crime to waste talent. The email was a few weeks old, buried under junk. He was asking if I was open to a small consulting project for a client who needed help with a short term campaign. And then this line, understanding if you've moved on, but wanting at least to give you the option. I sat there, reading it 3 times, ridiculous tears stinging my eyes. It felt like a hand reaching back from a past version of me I'd almost forward. My first instinct was to close the laptop and pretend I'd never seen it. Starting over at my age after so many years out of the game sounded terrifying. But then I looked at the spreadsheet again at that number next to wedding costs, and something in me snapped. Just enough. My voice was shaky, so shaky I had to clear my throat and pretend the connection was bad. But David was his usual warm, straightforward self. He told me the project was still open because the client had dragged their feet. He said he remembered how good I'd been at this, that he had no doubt I could jump right back in. And I wanted to tell him that I wasn't that person anymore, that I spent my days doing laundry and making sure the pantry was stocked and pretending that was enough. Instead, I said yes. I agreed to take the project, to send over a proposal by the end of the week. The second I hung up, I burst into tears right there in the kitchen. I was relieved, terrified, and furious all at the same time. I felt like I was cheating on my own marriage just by saying yes to something that was for me. That night, when Mark came home, the kitchen wasn't filled with the usual smells of dinner. There was no neat row of folded towels on the counter. I was on the couch with my laptop open, notes spread around me, and his face did this little confused twitch like he'd walked into the wrong house. He asked what was going on. I told him I'd picked up some freelance work, that I was doing a consulting project for an old contact. I tried to keep my tone casual, like this was just a little thing. But inside I was shaking. He frowned, asked why I hadn't told him I was even looking. I said because I'd only just decided to say yes. He reminded me how hard it would be to juggle everything, that taking on work now on top of the house stuff would be stressful. I just looked at him and said, Mark, if you want me to pay you back for the wedding, I need an income, right? He didn't have much to say after that, but he did look vaguely annoyed that there was no dinner, which was honestly the highlight of my evening. The next day, while he was at work, I did something that felt both petty and completely necessary. I sat down with a blank notebook and started making a list of every single thing I did on a regular basis to keep our lives running. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, meal planning, groceries, scheduling appointments, organizing paperwork, managing bills he never even saw because I just made sure everything was auto paid, all of it. Then I opened a search tab and looked up average hourly rates for house cleaners, personal chefs, laundry services, errand runners, even childcare, even though we didn't have kids yet, just to watch the numbers climb in my head. I gave each task a conservative number of hours per week and multiplied it out. When I finally added everything together, I laughed. This short, bitter little laugh, because the total was more than I'd earned back in my early marketing days. It was like the universe was confirming what I already knew but had never dared to say out loud. I had been working this whole time just without a paycheck. When he came home that evening, I met him at the table with my own handwritten list and my own rough breakdown. I slid it across to him like we were at some kind of negotiation. I told him that if we were talking about fairness, then we needed to account for the value of the work I'd been doing while he was at the office. That you can't pretend half the labor in a household doesn't count just because it doesn't show up in a bank statement. I honestly expected him to look at it and have at least a flicker of understanding, maybe even embarrassment. Instead, he glanced over it and actually laughed. He told me nobody pays for those things in a marriage, Chloe. Those are just things wives do. Putting a price on them is ridiculous and kind of offensive. He said, if you want to work now because your friend David dangled some project, that's fine. But you shouldn't try to rewrite history like you've been some underpaid employee. That was the night I stopped washing his clothes. A few days later, his mother, Susan, called me out of nowhere, which was my first clue that he had started sharing a very edited version of our problems with his family. She opened with small talk about holiday plans and then, as if she'd just remembered, asked if everything was all right at home because her son had sounded stressed. I said we were working through some things, trying to keep it vague, but she pushed. She always did. Eventually, she brought up the fact that I was, in her words, creating tension over something as simple as updating how we handled money. She reminded me very pointedly how much they had done for us, how they'd paid for most of the wedding, how they'd helped with the down payment when we bought the house, how grateful she had been to see her son step into the role of provider the way his father never had the chance to. It was clear whose side she was on before I even opened my mouth. When I told her he had asked me to pay him back for our wedding, there was a long pause on the line. Then she said, like she was choosing each word carefully, that maybe he had gone about it the wrong way, but that it was understandable for a man to reassess when he felt taken for granted. I wanted to ask her when exactly she thought I had taken anything for granted. Was it during the nights I stayed up late meal prepping so he could grab something on his way out the door? The weekends I spent cleaning the house so Susan wouldn't see a single speck of dust when they docked her? Opad by unannounced, the years I sat next to him at family dinners while he soaked up praise for being such a hard worker and everyone treated my contributions like background noise. Instead, I bit my tongue until I could taste blood and told her I appreciated her concern, but that this was between me and Mark. She didn't like that answer. I could hear it in the way her voice cooled. By the time we hung up, I knew one more bridge had quietly shifted under my feet. It sounds petty when I say it out loud, but I had reached the point where every sock I folded felt like a little betrayal of myself. I did my own laundry, I cooked for myself, I cleaned up after myself, and I left his mess exactly where he made it. His dishes stayed in the sink. His shirts stayed draped on the back of chairs, his empty snack wrappers lived on the coffee table, and I tried very hard not to care when the apartment started to look like a college dorm room on his side. The guilt gnawed at me constantly because every time I walked past a pile of his stuff, I heard my mother's voice in my head telling me not to be spiteful, that a good wife takes care of her home. But I also heard Mark's voice reading off lines from that spreadsheet. And between the two, the anger won more often. A week later, when he still hadn't gotten the hint, and the bed felt like a cold negotiation table instead of a place to sleep, I moved his things into the guest room. I did it while he was at work, boxing up his shirts, his ties, and the books he never actually read but liked to display. I left his side of the dresser empty. When he came home and saw his stuff in the smaller room at the end of the hall, he stared at me like I had set the house on fire. I told him calmly that if we were partners now, then separate spaces made sense until we figured out how to live like people who actually respect each other. I said I needed room to breathe and to work and to remember who I was without constantly bumping into his resentment. He told me I was overreacting, that couples fight and adjust and move on, that I was making a big deal out of what he called a simple spreadsheet. Then he tried to sleep on the couch to prove some kind of point, but after one night, his back hurt and he grudgingly took the guest room. Meanwhile, I was juggling my new project with all this chaos. It felt like living in parallel universes. During the day, I was on calls with David and his client, going over campaign ideas and timelines, and the part of my brain that had always loved this work lit up like it had been asleep and someone finally flipped the switch. I had to schedule the calls during certain windows when I knew Mark wouldn't be home. I would close the door to the guest room, which I had quietly turned into my office, and put on headphones so I could pretend I was somewhere else. When footsteps came down the hall unexpectedly early, I would minimize screens out of habit, like I was a teenager hiding some secret, even though nothing I was doing was actually wrong. Still, I didn't tell him the full scope of the project, how many hours it was taking, or how much I was making, because some private survival instinct had kicked in and was whispering that maybe this time I needed something that was mine alone. As the weeks went on, I noticed that his new favorite topic of conversation, besides how exhausted he was from being the only real earner in the house, was his coworker. He never used Gary's name with me anymore. He would just say, one of the guys at work said this or that, or a friend from the office had gone through something similar. And every single time his opinions lined up perfectly with whatever this man supposedly thought, he started saying things like, men these days can't be too careful, that you never know when a relationship is going to blow up and leave you with nothing, and that guys had to look out for each other. One night when he thought I was in the bedroom, I heard him in the little office nook on the phone, his voice low and tense. He said he was just trying to do things the right way, that he didn't want to get blindsided, that he'd seen other men get taken to court and lose everything. I stood in the hallway listening, feeling like an eavesdropper in my own life. And that was the night I opened a separate account at a different bank using my phone and put the first payment from the project straight into it. I told myself it wasn't some dramatic secret stash, that I was simply being practical. But I still felt ridiculous doing it. I took screenshots of the statements and saved them in a folder with a boring name on my laptop. And every time an invoice got paid, I moved that money into the account and left our joint one untouched as much as possible. It felt like building a little lifeboat plank by plank while pretending I wasn't actually planning to jump ship, and I hated that it had come to that. But I hated even more the feel of that spreadsheet under my fingertips. It became this quiet habit, checking the balance of my secret account when he was in the shower or out with friends, watching the number creep up slowly, feeling a tiny spark of safety each time. The more I stepped back from the unpaid labor in our house, the more he escalated. First, it was small comments about how the place looked, then sighs when he had to dig for clean socks or realized there was no dinner waiting. Then it moved into these long speeches about how he felt disrespected and taken for granted, which was honestly rich coming from a man who had turned our marriage into a retroactive invoice. He started waving the spreadsheet around Dag. Ain, this time with little notes scribbled in the margins about interest and inflation and how actually I owed even more if we wanted to be precise. He would sit across from me and tap a pen on the table, talking about Timlines for when I planned to start contributing my half, sprinkled with digressions about how lazy wives these days had no idea how grateful they should be. I could feel myself shrinking and sharpening at the same time. On the one hand, all those voices from my childhood kept telling me I was being ungrateful. That good wife sucked it up and adjusted. On the other hand, another voice, the one that sounded suspiciously like David, kept saying this was insane, that I wasn't crazy for feeling used. Eventually, after one particularly exhausting weekend where he spent the whole time making snide comments about my work calls and the laundry pile, I made an appointment with a divorce lawyer. I did it on my lunch break on a day when he thought I was at the grocery store, sitting in my car in the parking lot while the air conditioning hummed and my hands shook on the steering wheel. The lawyer's office smelled like coffee and printer ink, and there were framed diplomas on the wall that made me feel like a child sitting in the principal's office. I told her everything, starting way before the spreadsheet, because it felt dishonest to pretend this all started at one dinner. I talked about quitting my job at his insistence, about the promises he had made, about the way his tune had changed once his coworkers started feeding him horror stories. I told her about the retroactive wedding bill line that he thought was reasonable, and about my secret bank account, and about how he seemed to be building a case in his head where I was some lazy freeloader. She listened without interrupting, which almost made me cry more than anything she said because I had Bay, and explaining and defending myself for so long that the silence felt like a relief. When I was done, she said very calmly that what he was doing had a name: financial control. She said it was not always obvious even to the person on the receiving end, especially when it was dressed up in the language of fairness and partnership. She told me that in our state, the years I had spent running our home counted, that the assets accumulated during the marriage were considered marital property, not his personal trophies. She didn't promise me miracles or guarantee outcomes, which I respected, but she did lay out a few options. She said if I wanted out, we could start with a formal letter requesting a fair division of what we had built together, and that his little retroactive tab for the wedding had no legal basis. I walked out of there feeling like someone had quietly put a spine back into my body. On the drive home, I almost turned toward my parents' neighborhood out of pure muscle memory. Anytime something big happened in my life, good or bad, I used to end up at their house sooner or later, sitting at the same old kitchen table where my mother had once cried over overdue bills while my father pretended not to notice. I didn't actually pull into their driveway that day, but I parked around the corner from my own place and sat there with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel and thinking about how my mother was going to react when she heard I had talked to a lawyer. There's no script in my family for someone walking away from a marriage that doesn't involve words like failure and shame tossed around like confetti. I held off for a week before I told her. It came out over Sunday dinner because, of course, it did. My mother had made this big roast like we were celebrating something, and my sister, Sarah, had dragged herself in late with a hangover and a story about some man who had ghosted her after promising the world. For a minute, I almost let the night be about that because it was familiar and easy to dissect someone else's mess instead of putting mine on the table. Then my mother started in on how lucky I was to have a husband who provided, how some women would kill for that kind of stability, and the words just burst out of me before I could stop them. I told her I'd met with a divorce lawyer. The fork dropped out of her hand and clattered against the plate. Sarah's eyes went wide and then sharp, like she was already ready to pick a side in a fight that hadn't even started. My mother asked if I was joking. When I said no, she asked if he had cheated or hit me or done something unforgivable, because in her mind, those were the only valid reasons to leave. I said he had shown me a spreadsheet and asked me to pay him back for our wedding like it was a loan, and she just stared at me like she was trying to translate that into a language she understood. She asked very slowly if I was sure I wasn't overreacting. She reminded me that his parents had paid for most of it, that they had been generous, that plenty of brides would have loved a ceremony like the one we had. It was like she hadn't heard the part where he wanted retroactive reimbursement. Sarah, to her credit, actually snapped first. She said, "Are you serious? You think it's normal for a man to decide 7 years and that his wife owes him a bill for the dress and the flowers?" She reminded my mother how many times she had called me lucky when I first got engaged, how she had framed that whole day as some kind of peak I should be grateful for the rest of my life. My mother replied that marriage is work and that money fights happen, that maybe he was just scared and reaching for control in the only way he knew how. I sat there listening to them rague about my life like I wasn't even in the room and thought about the lawyer's calm voice saying what he was doing had a name: financial control. A power imbalance dressed up as fairness. I finally cut in and said I wasn't asking for permission. I was telling them what was happening. That went over exactly as well as you'd expect. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Sarah grabbed my hand under the table like she couldn't decide if she wanted to comfort me or shake me, and I felt this strange mix of guilt and relief settle in my stomach. Later that night, Sarah texted me a stream of messages full of typos and half finished thoughts about how she was proud of me and also terrified for me. She reminded me that our mother was from a different time, that leaving felt to her like ripping up a story she had already framed on the wall. I told her I didn't have the energy to be the good daughter and the good wife at the same time anymore. She sent back a heart and a joke about printing my face on a warning poster that said, "Do not let office bros run your marriage." I laughed harder than the joke deserved, but it helped. It reminded me that not everyone in my orbit thought I was losing my mind just because I was done being itemized on a spreadsheet. After that meeting, I became meticulous in a way that would have impressed my old bosses. I gathered bank statements, tax returns, receipts, anything that showed where the money had gone over the years. Back when we were happy and he trusted me completely, I was the one who handled most of the boring paperwork. So, a lot of the passwords were saved on our computer. I backed up files to a thumb drive I kept buried in a box of old holiday decorations, because if he ever bothered to go through those, we had bigger problems anyway. I kept working on my consulting projects and shuffling the payments into my separate account, and I answered his questions about my schedule with half truths that were technically not lies, which made it easier not to choke on them. He started to notice the shift long before he realized what it meant. At first, he tried to bargain. He would come home with takeout and act like nothing was wrong, then casually slide the spreadsheet back onto the table like we were just picking up a conversation. When I didn't bite, he took a different approach. Some days he would be almost sweet, talking about how maybe he had been a little harsh, how he didn't want us to fight, how he just wanted to feel like we were on the same team. Other days he would accuse me of being cold, of punishing him, of trying to make him feel guilty for wanting something that was supposedly normal. He changed the password on our home internet one afternoon, claiming it was for security, and then conveniently forgot to give it to me until I made a scene. He canceled a joint card we used for groceries, telling me he was reorganizing finances, and that it was easier if things went through his account since he was the one paying most of the bills anyway. The day I really snapped was stupidly mundane. I had just gotten off a really good call with David and the client. One of those calls where ideas are flowing and it feels like your brain has woken up after a long nap. And I walked into the kitchen to find a mountain of dirty dishes teetering in the sink. There were pans with dried sauce, plates crusted with food from nights of microwave meals I hadn't eaten, mugs with coffee rings, the whole thing like some kind of art installation titled Proof That He Thinks You Are Still His Maid. I called his name and asked him, probably a little too loudly, why he thought it was my job to clean up his mess when he had made it very clear that we were equals now. He threw his hands up and said he had been busy, that work was killing him, that I knew he hated doing dishes. And then he added this line about how everything had been fine until I started working again and acting like I was above our life. Something in me snapped quietly but completely. I told him I wanted a divorce. The words came out so clearly that for a second I thought someone else had said them. He laughed at first, a disbelieving little huff, and said I was being ridiculous, that couples say things they don't mean when they're stressed. I repeated it slower this time and told him I had already spoken to a lawyer, that papers would be coming, that this was not a threat, it was a decision. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He asked me if this was really about one spreadsheet, and I told him it was about 7 years of being treated like an accessory whose work didn't count until he wanted to bill me for it. The next day, my lawyer sent the letter. It laid out the basics: that I was seeking a dissolution of the marriage, that I was requesting a fair split of the house and the savings and the retirement accounts based on our state's laws. No drama, no insults, just dry legal language that made my entire life sound like a file in a cabinet. He called me from the parking lot of his office when he got it, voice shaking with anger, saying he couldn't believe I had dragged some stranger into our private business. He accused me of trying to rob him, of listening to people who didn't understand our relationship. And when I pointed out that he had been listening to Gary for months, he said that was different because that guy knew what it was like to be a man under pressure. Over the next weeks, things got ugly in a way that was not cinematic, just exhausting. He hired his own lawyer, who apparently bought his narrative that I had done nothing for years and now way. Anti to walk away with half of everything, he started spreading stories to mutual friends and family about how I had changed, about how money had gone to my head again now that I was consulting, about how he was just trying to protect himself. In their version, I had abandoned him. Not just now with this divorce, but back when I quit my job, too. Because apparently there was no way to get it right. Anytime I raised my voice, it became proof that I was unstable. Anytime I didn't respond to his text right away, it became proof that I didn't care. In the middle of all this, I got offered a permanent position with the client I had been consulting for. It wasn't flashy, just a steady marketing role at a company that wanted someone who could handle campaigns without a lot of hand-holding. But to me, it sounded like someone handing me a rope when I felt like I was slipping down a cliff. I accepted on the spot, then sat in my car in their parking lot and cried again, because apparently that was my new personality trait. I didn't tell Mark about the job. I told him I was still just doing projects here and there because part of me couldn't stand the idea of him twisting even this into another bullet point on his list of grievances. We went to mediation because that's what the court requires before they let you tear each other apart in front of a judge. We sat across the table from each other with our lawyers at our sides and a neutral person in the middle whose job it was to pretend this was all just a business deal gone sideways. His lawyer repeated the same line over and over, that my contribution had been minimal and emotional, while his had been concrete and financial. My lawyer calmly slid copies of old tax returns across the table, highlighting the years when my bonus had paid for house renovations and debt payoff back when I was still working, and the mediator nodded like they were grading a paper. At one point, his lawyer made an offer that sounded insultingly low, the kind of number that might have tempted a version of me who just wanted to get it over with and never see any of them again. My lawyer leaned over and whispered that I didn't have to take it, that it was okay to say no, that this was about the rest of my life, not just the next few months. I said no. My voice shook again because apparently my vocal cords hadn't gotten the memo that I was trying to be a different person now. But I still said it. We walked out of that session without a deal, and I went home to my little rented apartment and flopped face down on the bed and let myself think just for a second that maybe I was in over my head. Eventually, though, the back and forth worn down more than me. Another round of mediation, another pile of documents, another quiet explanation from my lawyer about what the law actually said versus what his friend at work thought it said. And finally, there was an offer that didn't make me want to flip the table. It was more than I had ever seen in my personal account at once, and less than what I had hoped for on paper, which probably means it was genuinely fair. I signed the agreement with my hand shaking, not just from what it meant now, but from what it represented about the girl who had walked away from her career for a promise and was now slowly dragging herself back. When the divorce was finalized, it happened in this tiny courtroom that looked nothing like the ones on television. There were no dramatic speeches, no slamming gavels, just a judge reading through paperwork in a bored voice, while a clerk stamped things. I sat there in a plain dress I had bought on sale with my lawyer next to me and listened to someone refer to my marriage as a case number. I signed the last set of forms, felt my eyes burn again, and told myself that crying didn't make me weak. It just meant this actually mattered. He was there too, across the room, looking tired and stubborn and a little lost. He didn't try to talk to me afterward, just nodded once when our eyes accidentally met in the hallway like we were distant relatives at a funeral. The settlement hit my account a few days later. I watched the numbers update on the screen and felt this mix of nausea and relief, like when a plane finally lands after a long, bumpy flight. I knew that money didn't erase what had happened, that it wasn't some magical reward for pain. But it did mean I could stop living in a rented place that still smelled faintly of the last tenant. I found a modest apartment in a quieter neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but with enough light and a little patch of grass outside the window where I could put a chair and drink coffee without worrying about stepping on a forgotten sock. I bought furniture I liked, nothing that reminded me of what we had picked out together. I learned how it felt to sit in a space that was entirely mine, where every dish in the sink belonged to me, and nobody could turn around and use it as ammunition. Months later, when I went back to the old house to collect a few things I had left behind in the rush, I saw one of his friends from work helping him move some of his stuff into storage. They were laughing about something, shoving boxes into the back of a truck, and I watched from my car for a second before they spotted me. He gave me an awkward little wave, and I waved back, then went inside and grabbed my box of old books without staying to chat. On the drive back to my new place, I realized I didn't feel rage the way I thought I would. I felt tired mostly, and weirdly sorry that he had chosen to build his sense of manhood out of the opinions of men who would never have to live with the consequences. My life didn't become magically perfect after that, obviously. My days were full in a way they hadn't been in years, but that didn't mean they were easy. At work, people started looping me into bigger projects now that I wasn't constantly trying to juggle everything around someone else's unpredictable moods. The first time my boss asked if I would be willing to travel for a client meeting, I hesitated out of habit, waiting for the phantom disapproval that used to hang over any decision that might take me out of the house overnight. Then I remembered there was no one at home keeping score anymore. I said yes, and later that night I stood in my little kitchen staring at a suitcase on the counter and laughed at myself for almost asking permission from a ghost. There were social adjustments too. Some friends dropped off the map as soon as the divorce was final, like my single status was contagious and they couldn't risk catching it. Others surprised me by showing up harder than they ever had when my life looked more put together from the outside. One couple invited me to their game nights and made a point of not seating me at the pity end of the table. A coworker turned friend dragged me out to a trivia night at a bar and introduced me as her brilliant teammate instead of as a recent divorce, which felt small and enormous at the same time. Being treated as a whole person instead of as half of a broken unit did something to my brain I'm still not sure how to describe. Running into people from my old neighborhood was less fun. Once in the frozen food aisle at the store near my former house, I bumped into one of Mark's cousins. She gave me the tight smile people reserve for funerals and messy breakups and asked in that sugary tone how I was holding up. Before I could answer, she launched into a story about how hard the divorce had been on him, how much he had, fed me, how nobody is perfect, and maybe I had been too quick to make everything about money. I stood there holding a box of sad vegetables and listened as she gently rewrote our entire history to cast him as the wounded provider and me as the ungrateful wife who couldn't appreciate how good she had it. For a second, the old guilt rose up, hot and familiar. I almost started explaining myself the way I had in the beginning, listing every small humiliation like exhibits in a case, trying to get her to understand that it was not about one spreadsheet. It was about years of being treated as an expense instead of a partner. Then I caught myself. I realized I didn't owe her or anyone in that family a point by point breakdown of why I'd reached my limit. So I just smiled, said I hoped he was doing whatever he needed to do to be happy, and steered my cart away. My hands were shaking a little on the handle, but it was the satisfying kind of shake that comes from holding a boundary for once instead of swallowing everything just to keep the peace. My new job had its own stresses, and living alone again after years of being half of a couple was both freeing and lonely in ways I hadn't expected. I had nights where I sat on my little couch with takeout and crappy television and thought maybe I had made a huge mistake. That maybe I had made a huge mistake. That maybe I had thrown away something that could have been fixed. Then I would remember that spreadsheet and his voice quoting Gary about how only suckers carried the whole load. And I would feel that same cold clarity settle back into my bones. About 6 months after the divorce, I was in a coffee shop near my office, laptop open, pretending I was going to get ahead on a project and actually just scrolling through nothing, when someone slid into the seat across from me without asking. I looked up and there he was, Gary, the coworker, the one who had sickly been a ghost in my marriage until he wasn't. He looked exactly how I remembered from company parties, a little too pleased with himself, the kind of guy who thought every story was about him if you let him talk long enough. He grinned like we were old friends and asked how I had been, like he hadn't played a starring role in blowing up my life. For a second, I thought about getting up and leaving, just walking out and letting the door swing shut behind me in this dramatic movie exit. But curiosity pinned me in place. I wanted to know what he would say, what story he had told himself about all of this. So I stayed. He asked about my job, and when I told him I was working again, really working, his eyebrows went up and he said, he always knew I had it in me. Then, without missing a beat, he started in with these little compliments that were so clearly rehearsed, it was almost funny. How I looked great, how some people fall apart after a divorce, but I clearly hadn't. How he always thought I was too smart to just stay home. He leaned in a little too close when he said it, hand brushing mine on the table, and my brain finally caught up to where this was going. He was flirting with me, not in some subtle, maybe I'm misreading this way, but openly. He mentioned that Mark had taken the breakup hard, that he had tried to be there for him as a friend, and then he dropped this line about how sometimes two people are just not a match, even if one of them is really great. The implication hung there between us like a bad smell. When that didn't get any reaction other than my eyebrows climbing into my hairline, he went further, saying things like, if we had met under different circumstances, who knows what might have happened? I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing in his face because the audacity was honestly so ridiculous it looped back, round to entertaining. I told him as plainly as I could that I was not interested. He chuckled and said he understood, that I had been through a lot, that maybe it was too soon, but his eyes said he didn't actually believe me. After he left, I found messages from him in my social media inbox. Little follow ups that started out casual and quickly shifted into more overt suggestions. He wrote that Mark never had to know that we were both adults, that we deserved to have some fun. I didn't respond to any of them. I took screenshots. I saved them in a folder with a boring name right next to the financial documents and the emails from my lawyer because a little voice in my head said this might not be over. In the weeks after that coffee shop ambush, I kept replaying the whole interaction in my head like a bad episode of some low budget drama, not because I was tempted, but because it said so much about the world I had been living in without really seeing it. Here was this man who had sat across from Mark and fed him lines about fairness and partnership and not being taken advantage of. And the second the dust settled, he had the nerve to act like I was some kind of prize up for grabs. It made me question every conversation they had probably had about me over those work lunches, every joke at my expense dressed up as friendly concern. I took all that anger and confusion into therapy, which is something I probably should have done years before any of this blew up. The therapist was this calm, slightly sarcastic woman who had clearly heard every variation of my story at least 10 times from other people. She didn't gasp at the wedding invoice or call my ex a monster. She just tilted her head and asked why it had taken that particular spreadsheet to make me finally consider leaving. We spent whole sessions unpacking the way I had been trained to be grateful for B, intrusion. How I had swallowed little compromises over and over until something as absurd as retroactive billing slid under the radar as just one more thing I should probably try to understand. She asked about my own patterns too, which was annoying in the way that all accurate observations are. I had to admit that I'd gotten something out of being the flexible one, the accommodating one, the wife who could spin any unreasonable request into a story about being supportive. It made me look good. It made me feel needed. It also slowly erased me, but that part was easier to ignore while the compliments were still coming. Sitting on that couch with a cheap tissue in my hand, I had to say out loud that I had participated in my own sidelining. Not because I liked being controlled, but because I was terrified of what it would mean if I stopped smoothing everything over. Dating, when I finally dipped a toe into it, was strange and awkward and sometimes unintentionally funny. I went on a handful of casual dates with men who were perfectly fine on paper and absolutely wrong for me in practice. There was the guy who grilled me about my ex, like he was collecting data for a case study. The one who made a joke about women loving drama right after I told him the basics of my divorce. The one who visibly twitched when I said I handled my own finances now. None of them were monsters. They were just little reminders that my bar had shifted, that I was no longer going to nod along while someone explained my own life back to me in a tone that suggested they knew better. There were also quiet nights when I didn't go out at all, when I canceled plans because the idea of putting on real clothes and making small talk felt like a chore I hadn't agreed to. On those nights, I would curl up on my slightly lumpy couch with a cheap blanket and whatever leftovers I had managed not to burn, and I would let myself feel sad without immediately framing it as progress. Everyone loves a comeback story. But the middle part, the messy part where you are just sort of existing and healing at the speed of a snail on a bad day, does not make it into the highlight reel. It is not glamorous, but it is where most of the actual work happens. By the time my ex finally emailed me, I was not healed or transformed or any of those dramatic words people like to use. I was just steadier. My job felt real. My apartment felt like home instead of like a temporary hiding place. My friendships were less about venting and more about actual connection again. So when his name popped up on my screen, my first reaction was not pure panic. It was more like a sharp, surprised ache. The way you feel when you press on a scar you forgot was there and realize it is still a little tender. Almost a year after the divorce, Mark emailed me. It was a simple message, just a short paragraph, saying there were things he wished he had said back then, that he had been doing a lot of thinking, that he wondered if I would be willing to meet and talk. My first reaction was to delete it and block him, because I had worked hard to build a life that didn't revolve around his moods, and I was not eager to crack that open. But then another part of me, the part that hated loose ends, wanted to hear what he thought he needed to say. So I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near a park, neutral territory, plenty of people around, no risk of accidentally slipping back into old habits just because the kitchen smelled familiar. He looked older when he walked in, and not just in the obvious ways. There were lines on his face that hadn't been there before, a heaviness in the way he moved that made me think of someone walking through water instead of air. He ordered his drink and sat down. And for a minute, we just did that awkward small talk dance about work and weather and how time flies. Then he took a breath and said he was sorry. He was sorry for the spreadsheet, for the wedding bill, for listening to other people more than he listened to his own wife. He said he had been doing therapy, that his therapist had pointed out some things that made him want to crawl under a rock, like how he had equated control with security, and how he had been so desperate not to feel like a failure that he had turned me into the enemy. He said he missed me, He missed us. He said that if I was willing, he wanted another chance to do it differently, to actually be partners in the way he had pretended he wanted back then, but clearly had not understood. He talked about how he had cut off some of the guys he used to listen to, how he saw now that their advice came from fear and bitterness, not wisdom. Part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me sat there listening and thought maybe this was the version of him I'd always hoped would show up. The rest of me remembered every time he had dismissed my work, my time, my contributions, and how easily he had thrown those things onto a spreadsheet when someone told him to. I let him talk until he ran out of words, until the coffee in his cup went cold and the people around us had all changed over at least once. Then I took out my phone. I opened the folder with the screenshots and pulled up the messages from Gary, the ones I had been saving for months without really knowing why. I slid the phone across the table and told him to read them. At first, he looked confused, eyes flicking over the little bubbles like he was not quite processing what he was seeing. Then his face changed, the color drained, his mouth tightened, and his hand clenched around the cup so hard I thought it might crack. He asked me if I had responded. I told him no, that I had shut it down without engaging. Because even at my angriest, cheating had never been an option I wanted. I told him I had only kept the messages because some part of me had known that one day they might matter. He stared at the phone like it was full of snakes and said that this explained a lot, that things between him and Gary had gotten weird, that they had drifted, that he couldn't quite put his finger on why. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that maybe he should have realized sooner that someone who encouraged him to treat his wife like a line item might not be a trustworthy source on relationships. He looked at me then, really looked, and asked if knowing all this changed anything for me. If knowing he had been manipulated, that someone had been actively undermining our marriage for their own ego or amusement, made me see him differently. I thought about it. I thought about it. I thought about how easy it would be to pin everything on that one guy, to act like Mark had been a helpless victim of bad influences. Then I thought about the nights I had spent awake next to him while he slept peacefully after dropping emotional grenades on our life. About how quickly he had believed it when someone told him I was using him. About how he had turned to them instead of sitting down with me like an actual partner. I told him the truth. I said it did change something in that I now felt less pure anger and more complicated sadness, but it did not erase the choices he had made. He asked if I would ever consider trying again. Not right away, he said. Not like some movie where we walk out of tit. He coffee shop hand in hand, but someday maybe if he kept doing the work and showed me he had really changed. I looked at the man I had once promised to stay with for the rest of my life, and I realized that I didn't know him anymore. Not really. I believed he was working on himself. I believed he was genuinely horrified by what Gary had done. I did not believe that going back into that house, into that role, into that dynamic would suddenly be okay just because everyone was sorry now. So I said no. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just a quiet no that felt like closing the door gently instead of slamming it. I told him I hoped he kept going to therapy. I told him I hoped he figured out how to have relationships that were not built on spreadsheets and outside commentary. I told him I didn't wish him harm, that I didn't lie awake at night, fantasizing about his life falling apart, but that my life had finally started to feel like mine again, and I was not willing to gamble that away. He nodded, eyes shiny, and for a second I almost reached out to touch his hand, then stopped myself. We said goodbye like people who had once shared everything and now shared almost nothing. And then I walked back to my car and sat there with my forehead on the steering wheel until the buzzing in my head calmed down. 2 years later, I have a job I actually like, an apartment that is mine, and a partner who doesn't treat my contributions like optional add ons. I still flinch sometimes when someone mentions spreadsheets, and I still catch myself over explaining decisions that don't need justification, but I am working on it. The scars from that marriage are not gone, but they are quieter now, more like old stories I tell myself when I need to remember why I left, instead of fresh bruises I keep poking just to see if they still hurt. I heard through mutual friends that Mark cut ties with Gary completely after our last conversation, that their little friend group fractured when the truth came out. I hope he learned something from that. I hope the next person he builds a life with does not have to teach him that love is not a balance sheet and that you cannot keep a relationship healthy by outsourcing all your decisions to whoever's loudest at the lunch table. As for me, I pay my own bills now. I make my own choices. And when someone tries to tell me that asking for fairness is the same as asking for too much, I don't shrink anymore. I just remember that dinner table, that spreadsheet, that moment when I realized no one else gets to define my worth. That is the real ending. Not a perfect happily ever after, just the stubborn, messy truth that I am allowed to take up space at my own table without apologizing for the seat. I'm still processing so much from this journey, and I know many of you have faced similar battles for your worth. If you've ever had to fight to be seen as an equal, or if you've been in a relationship where fairness was just a cloak for control, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I'm reading everything.